Hey guys, today I'm at Steadfast Farm and I want to talk about 4 of the main implements that are used with the BCS system for market gardens. And so there's many other implements out there, but I just want to do an overview video talking about the 4 primary ones that you're going to see on market gardens. So let's start with the machine itself. This is an old 853. I actually use a 739, and for my application for the market gardening I've been doing and what you guys know me for, it's served me just fine. It's a smaller machine, which I prefer primarily because on my farm I have 50-foot beds and I do a lot more turning around, so I wanted something that's a bit more lean, but also because I am loading that into a truck to take it to different plots, so I wanted something that was a little bit light. Now, for the machine itself, there's some features that I think are an absolute must. And pretty much, actually, you know what? It's pretty much just one feature that I think is an absolute must. And that is to have differential wheel lock. That means that when you turn the machine around, each wheel, you can pivot in a perfect 180-degree turn. So when you go down a bed and then you stop and turn around, you're not going to shift over into the other bed or shift out into the path, the main path between. You're going to stay perfectly stationary. I find that is the most crucial feature of a BCS. Now, some of these handles here are things like brakes. I mean, this is your primary clutch on here, but then you've got these outside ones which are basically wheel brakes. And I don't actually find them necessary at all. It depends on what some people do, but I find if you have your differential wheel lock, when you put your clutch in and you turn around, you're going to turn around perfectly in 180 degrees, and so the wheel brakes aren't really that necessary. That's just my opinion. And then this handle here is what actually just rotates the handlebars. This is one thing that BCS is really known for, which is very handy for market gardeners, is because you want to offset your handlebars like this when you're going up one way in the bed, and then you might want to offset it another way if you're going to come back down. So that's really handy. Now, that's really all I want to talk about on the machine end of this. There's a lot more we could go into, and we could talk about different types of models, but just again, this is an older 853 and I've been using a 739 forever, and I think it suits me just fine. The thing that's important too to understand is that there are certain models that will or will not allow certain implements. The 739 that I have is big enough to run all of these implements that we're going to talk about. So let's start with just an overview of our implements, and then we'll go into each one in detail. So we got a rotary plow here. We have got a power Harrow here. We've got a flail mower here, and then attached to the machine itself, we've got a rototiller equipped with a PDR, a precision depth roller, and I'll talk about those two things separately as if they were 2 implements. So let's start with our rotary plow. Basically, a rotary plow is a plow that has a screw-like fashion, and what it does is it shifts soil from one side to the next. And there's different types of rotary plows out there. There's stationary ones, and then there's also ones that you can change the direction of the plowing. I don't really know anybody that's using the ones that you can change. I find it does its job just fine if you know which way it goes and you just move in a different pattern to move the dirt from one side to the next. So what this tool is typically used for with market gardeners is for shaping beds. So you can see some beds behind me here. To create raised beds, you'll go up one side of the bed and push soil from the walkway into the bed, and then you'll come back around the other side and do the same thing. Jean-Martin Fortier really made this kind of famous in his book by showing how they shape beds. Now, this isn't needed for everybody. And like on my farm, I don't need this tool at all. I used it earlier in the day because I really found it was good for ripping up initial ground, like when you're breaking ground. And that's another purpose that it has, is one, breaking ground, but you have to be very careful on how you move the earth around. And another is shaping ground. So you might want to create some terraces and move a bunch of soil over one way. There's probably other things you can do with it too, but typically in a market gardening context, people are using the rotary plow to basically shape beds and create slightly hilled up raised beds. Now you're going to use this tool in tandem with some of the other implements, particularly the power harrow, to finish the bed to get a nice level. So let's talk about the power harrow. What a power harrow is, it's essentially a soil working implement like a rototiller, but it doesn't rototill. So on a rototiller, which we're going to look at, you've got tines that have an axis that is horizontal, meaning that the tines turn vertically, and that inverts the soil. Now there's a lot of reasons why you would or would not want to do that, but the power harrow is essentially a solution for people who want to operate low tillage. So they want to have minimal soil disturbance on the top. They like to be able to create a it looks like it's just been plowed, but it's not. The tines turn this way, and so there's this is the newer 28-inch from Thriviage. BCS America sells this, and so the tines still really go about 2 inches deep. You can see here from the side curtain, and this is, a finishing machine. So what Eric at Steadfast Farm has done for years is he didn't use a rototiller for a long time. He was just using the rotary plow in tandem with the power harrow. He would basically kick up dirt in from the walkways into the beds to give them a little bit of hilling, and then he would finish them off with the rotary plow. And so many farms could really just use this. It just depends on what you're doing. You could do most of your bed prep with this. Probably not initial prep, so breaking new ground, forming new beds, things like that. You're not going to use this tool for this. A harrow is really, for a market gardens, is just used for when beds they've been shaped and prepared, and this is just what you might use on an ongoing basis. So you've pulled a previous crop out, then you're going to run this to maybe mix in some new fertilizer or compost to get a nice level bed, and then you're going to seed the bed after that. So it has a roller on the back that basically, you've got your soil disturbance with the tines that mixes the soil up, and then the roller finishes the bed to give you a nice even level. And this is a Josephine lever, so you can basically adjust the height of the wheel, or the depth of the wheel, I should say, which makes the tines higher or lower off the ground. Here we've got a flail mower. This is a favorite of many market gardeners who are trying to keep their organic matter in place. And essentially what a flail mower does is it's like a mower, like a lawn mower, but instead of just having a vertical axis which spins a horizontal blade, it has a horizontal axis and spins vertical blades. So underneath there are flails. The difference between a flail mower and a normal mower is that the flail mower not only mows but grinds up all the organic matter, so you're left with basically a fine mulch. And you can take this tool and go over crops that are 2 or 3 feet tall, and you'll be amazed that once you pass over, you're left with basically, it looks like chopped up fine grass, and it does an incredible job. And so if you want to keep your organic matter in place, this is the tool to do it. Any of your spent crops, you basically run it over with this tool, and then you might finish it with a power harrow and then put a tarp on top, let that compost down for 1 to 3 weeks, and then you come back and then finish it with the power harrow, put in your new amendments, and then plant again. That's kind of typically how these are used, though there's different combinations on how you do certain things. Each market gardener has their own way of doing it, but essentially the flail mower basically just mows down and turns your previous crop into mulch. So let's talk about the PDR and the rototiller. First we'll talk about the tiller, then we'll talk about the PDR. So a rototiller is it's probably the most common implement that you could use for any type of tractor. And a tiller basically just mixes up your soil. So it has a horizontal axis and the tines spin vertically. Now I'll just point out one pro and one con to rototilling. The pro of rototilling is it allows you to mix in soil amendments into your soil. So the biggest reason for that would be is if you're turning a raw piece of land over and you want to change the composition of the soil, you put in a bunch of compost, you rototill it in. That actually allows you to change the physical composition of the soil, which is beneficial to getting production in there quickly, and it also loosens it up so that roots can grow down and there's more air in the soil and they can grow faster. Now the main con to rototilling is what's called hard pan, and this happens with excessive rototilling. If you're tilling the soil constantly, those tines are spinning. You might be going down about 8 inches. At the bottom of those 8 inches, you're going to be actually compacting the soil down a little bit, and that's going to create a hard pan. So you'll stick your hand in the soil after it's been tilled. It looks like nice and fluffy, but then you're going to reach this area that's kind of hard. And what's going to happen is your roots are going to grow down nice and easy for this 8 inches, and then they're going to hit that hard pan, and they're not going to know where to go. And so that can stunt your crops. It can make your carrots look short and stumpy. There's many things that it does. It can also affect the water flow. It can affect how nutrients and how nitrogen and oxygen cycle through your crops. There's many things that it does, but that's the most common drawback to rototilling. And what most people actually do to combat the hard pan is they use a broad fork. And people like Jean-Martin Fortier have made that tool famous. And in a market gardening context, that's how they're combating hard pan. There's many ways to combat that on a larger scale. You could use a subsoiler or a certain type of cultivation chisel that basically chisels down the soil and rips up that hard pan. Now the PDR is essentially a implement that I helped BCS come up with, where I said, I want to have a shallow cultivation, but I don't want to run a power harrow. And the main reason I didn't want to run a power harrow on my farm is because at the time it was a lot heavier than it is now, but also I didn't want to have to change implements. I wanted to have something all in one, because it's really all I do. On my farm, I don't change implements. I don't use any of the other implements, and that's partly because of the way that we operate our production, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But essentially what we wanted to do was have a cheaper, lighter, and easier to use implement that could establish a shallow cultivation. And so we came up with this idea of the PDR. When I came to BCS with this idea, I essentially said, why don't we just put a roller on the back of a tiller and see if we can jack it up and essentially do what a power harrow does. And that's more or less what we've done. So we have a roller on the back of the tiller, and it's attached to a Josephine lever, and you can adjust the height of the tiller to get a really shallow cultivation. And the thing that happened with this that I really liked is it made it so that the tiller actually operated better, because a tiller on its own has a steel curtain on the back that is just attached to a hinge point, and it kind of moves freely. So if you're prepping new ground and you're rototilling up a big area, those curtains kind of flop around. And so if you hit a root in the soil or a rock and your tiller bounces a little bit, you're going to see that little wave in the soil. Whereas with the wheel, you actually get a better finish because the wheel doesn't move around like the steel curtain does. It just kind of keeps it level. And so I found when shaping brand new ground, I get a way better level ground finish with the PDR. And that's something we discovered after the fact. Like, that wasn't something that was initially thought about with the original design. It was just to establish a shallow cultivation. Now, there's one thing I want to point out that is a disadvantage with the PDR versus a power harrow, and that is the fact that the tines spin vertically. That means if you're going through something that has a lot of organic matter, and say you're just trying to rototill in an old crop, that crop can get tied up in the tines. And it doesn't happen with a harrow, because the harrow tines are on a vertical axis and they spin horizontally. They don't get tangled up. And so that's what can happen with the PDR is the rototiller can essentially, you can get stuff locked up in the tines, which means that you have to go pull it out. Now, the way to combat that is two things. Either you run a flail mower before and you grind up that crop into a mulch, then when you go over with your PDR, it's not going to get tangled up in your tines. Or second, you actually remove the crop, put that in your compost, then you go into the PDR, and you might put in some new compost or some new fertilizer, basically put in your new soil amendments, and then you till them in shallow or however deep you want at that point. So that's how you get around it. And this is the primary reason why on my farm I don't use a flail mower and I don't do it the same way, is because my farm is so small, I don't have the luxury of time to basically flail mow a bed and then run a PDR or a Harrow and then tarp that bed to stale seed bed it for a couple weeks. I don't have that time. My protocol is to fully remove the organic matter, put in some new finished compost or soil amendments like fertilizers, manure, what have you, and then till them in, and then those beds are prepped to plant again. So I'm not doing an active stale seed bedding process in my growing season. I do at the beginning of my season and I do at the end of the season, but not in the middle of the season. And so that's the difference between a farm like mine and say a farm that Jean-Martin Fortier is doing, is that he's using a tarp in tandem with all these implements to allow the crop to decompose, and then they come in and refinish the bed and then plant again. So on my farm I can't do that, and so that's the difference. So for me, I don't need to even use a quick coupler, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but I basically have this permanently set up on my machine, bolted right to it, and I'm not changing my implements on a day-to-day or weekly basis. So that brings us to a conversation about the quick coupler. The quick coupler is essentially a piece of steel with a pin in it that can be attached with a simple lever, can be pulled out with a simple lever that allows you to change your implements really quickly. Without the quick coupler, you have to bring out a wrench and change 2 bolts every time you change an implement. And that just makes things really slow. So it really depends on your protocol. Just like how I explained for the reasons why I'm only using a PDR, it's because my protocol is to remove the previous organic matter from the crop, then I run my PDR. If you're not doing that and you're running, say, a flail mower, and then you're going to immediately use a PDR or a power harrow right after to finish that off, mix that into the soil a little bit so the crop can decompose, and then you might tarp it or something like that for a couple weeks, then you should have a quick coupler, because you're going to have to change that implement on a regular basis, and by not having that quick coupler, it's a hassle. So you really do need to have that if you're going to change your implements on a day-to-day basis. So those are our 4 primary implements that we're using on market gardens. And yes, of course, there's many different BCS implements out there. You can really go down a rabbit hole. You know, off my farm, I have a snowblower. I use the BCS snowblower in the winter to manage my sidewalk and my driveway and some of my neighbors' driveways and sidewalks. But that's not a farm implement, so that's a whole other conversation. But those are our 4 main implements: our rotary plow, our power harrow, our flail mower, and our tiller and PDR I kind of put together as one. So I hope you guys have found that helpful. I'm going to have a link in the show notes. It's going to take you to my website that has links to all of these implements. You can check them out and go to bcsamerica.com for more information. We'll see you in the next video.